Hello, everyone. We are excited to have you with us for this webinar. My name is Joshua Kroll, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing with Evexia Diagnostics. I want to welcome you all to this presentation regarding food sensitivity testing and the FIT test by KBMO. I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Wayne Sedano, the Director of Clinical Support and Education with Evexia Diagnostics, and a very special guest, James White, CEO of KBMO. James will be presenting an introduction to the clinical insights offered by food sensitivity testing with the KBMO FIT test or food inflammation test. Please keep in mind that this event will be the first in a series of 3 webinars. For those of you who may not know, James acquired the developer of the patented FIT test, which is the first assay to identify IGG1-4 and C3d, the inflammation marker, simultaneously for 176 foods, colorings, and additives. The ability to help reduce inflammation by personalizing a patient's diet has the promise to reduce symptoms in cardiovascular, diabetes, IBS, and other autoimmune diseases, as well as the opportunity to aid in weight loss. KBMO has expanded their product range to include a FIT 22, FIT 132, and FIT 176 assays, and soon to be launched Zonulin Assay. Now, without further ado, James White.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for that introduction. Much appreciated. And as the quite rightly pointed out, this is the first of 3. So I guess I'm the warm-up act, as it were, in terms of the other 2 gentlemen who are going to follow me over the coming months. And so my focus will be very much on the kind of basics of what we do and how we do it. And as I say, the key element with what we're doing is we're looking at 3 elements with one test. So we're looking at food sensitivities with the classical IGG1-4. We're looking at inflammation by the complement activation pathway. And then we're also looking at gut permeability with 3 distinct elements. So do you have more than 10 foods elevated on the panel? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Do you have elevated candida on the panel, as well as zonulin? And we'll talk about some exciting news we have in that area as well. And we're followed, and again, by Dr. Brent Dorval, who invented the test. So again, and as well as have the test patented. So he'll go through his, the idea is we're going to give you an opportunity to get a discounted kit. And then Dr. Dorval will come along on April the 13th and give a discussion on how you interpret the test. Because again, lots of people are familiar with testing, but it's great to get from an expert in the field like Dr. Dorval, how you interpret the test to give you the confidence that when you're in front of your patients, then you have that information to hand. And as well, what we've also found is that when that report has your name, the provider's name on the top of it, generally we all pay a little bit more attention. So again, those reports will be reviewed by Dr. Dorval. And so again, that'll be a really good Q&A opportunity to ask you any questions that you may have before you kind of let loose on your patients with this kind of testing. And then last, again, another kind of area that we found over the years is a tough one for all of us to kind of really get our hands on, is how do we implement the test in your practice? So again, we've taken the opportunity to invite Dr. Robert Silverman to talk to you around July 13th, just to kind of go through how did he implement the testing in the practice, what's a good patient, how's he found it, and how's it worked through. So hopefully with these 3 kind of brief overviews, it gives you some confidence in not only how the test works, how to interpret it, which is always important, and then more importantly, how you get the opportunity to then implement that into the practice. So without further ado, I'll kind of crank into some of the science and how we're working. The key is obviously looking to make sure that we're all understanding of what we're looking at here. So our focus is very much versus the allergy or intolerance, very much food sensitivity. And the reason we look at sensitivity is the delayed nature of it. And as you're all aware, it can be delayed up to 72 hours. So that makes it really tough for a patient to work out what it is they might have consumed in the last 72 hours are causing the symptoms that they come and present to when they come in and see you guys. Obviously, allergy is instant and something that, again, is generally pretty straightforward to work out. It's a cause and effect type approach, whereas, as I said, with the delayed nature of sensitivity, makes it harder. As well as the other element is the kind of symptoms can be, frankly, many and varied. And so often we're asked by providers, what's a good patient to run this test on? We've got just over 12,000 providers around the world running the test now, and so we're often asking the same question. And so these are the kind of symptoms that we hear kind of repeated on a pretty regular basis. Weight loss, as was mentioned at the top of the intro there, autoimmune, obviously migraines, and thyroid, obviously digestive, skin problems again, fatigue. So again, a lot of these areas, really what underpins them all is really inflammation. So frankly, in our mind, if you've got a patient who's inflamed, then this is a great test to work out which of the foods on an individualized basis are causing some of these symptoms that they're presenting with. So this is the when the providers are using it. The why is because, as I mentioned, that inflammation and the immune complexes that are associated with foods can be an underlying problem for many of the conditions that you see on a daily basis. And as I say, if you can use this test to help identify causes of inflammation, then that helps. If we can help reduce that inflammation, then that long list of symptoms that we're talking about, hopefully you'll see a kind of reduction in that when you're treating the patient, rather than that being inflamed. Then again, if we can help reduce it via their diet, then hopefully that's a good way forward in terms of helping kind of treat the root cause of what may be going on with those patients. So again, as I mentioned up front, we're looking at multiple pathways. So we don't just look at IgG, which is the kind of common garden approach to this. We're looking at IGG1-4, but then we're also looking at a secondary screen, as it were, with the complement activation. So the thing with IgG is it's a great way of measuring which foods you're exposed to. So it's measuring the part of your immune system which is measuring exposure to a food, but it then doesn't go on and do the key element that we think is really critical, and which is what we've had patented, is let's look as well as which foods are causing an inflammatory response. So rather than just stopping at what you're exposed to, which is what the IgG testing does, by adding the complement activation, you're going to do a secondary screen and you're measuring a downstream part of the immune system, which can only be triggered by an inflammatory response. And by doing that, what we found, it takes generally a long list of foods that you see with an IgG only test to really zero in on the key foods of interest with that secondary screen to say, okay, of that long list that you're exposed to, and generally a patient knows they're consuming, which ones amongst those are causing inflammation? And that's where the immune complexes and complement activation really kick in, because they can only be triggered if there's an inflammatory response. And that's why the shorter list of foods that you generally see on our testing, generally 5 to 15 per patient, really has a much more tight correlations with the symptoms that they present with. So in essence, we've come up with a way of eliminating the false positives that you see with IgG only testing, and really zero in on the key foods of interest, which helps not only in terms of a believability from a patient, but also compliance, which is the key thing when you're running any test. You want to make sure the patient's more likely to be compliant, and we do that by this great way of with a secondary screen of the complement activation as well. So again, we show this in a slightly different format on this slide. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the IgG only. As I say, there's some great labs out there running IgG only tests. The limitation isn't those labs, it's that pathway, because you're in essence only telling a patient what you're exposed to, and really you're leaving them with a lot of false positives. And I often hear from providers, you've got 20, 30 plus foods come up. It's really difficult to get my patient to kind of believe that all of those are affecting their, the way they're feeling. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see our patented approach. So again, we're the only lab who looks at combining these two together to give you a single score versus breaking it up, which again generally makes it a lot more complicated for a patient and a provider trying to explain that when they break that down. So our view is by combining them, it enables you to really zero in on the key foods of interest and gives you a very clear, easy way of reading this, with generally, as I mentioned, 5 to 15 foods per patient, which again is very manageable when it comes to a compliance perspective for most patients. So again, a bit of background on the company. We were set up in 2004 by a gentleman called Dr. Brent Dorval, who works very closely with me today. He's a graduate at MIT, and his not insignificant claim to fame was he invented the first rapid HIV diagnostic. So that infectious disease approach really percolates through a lot of the things we do as an organization. So for example, we run over 15 standards and controls per patient to make sure the testing is highly accurate, and highly reproducible, which has obviously been a knock in this area over the last few years. So the idea is, let's make sure it's highly accurate, highly reproducible by running many standards and controls to give you the confidence in the work that in the testing that we're running. It can be a blood draw or a finger stick. So again, that gives us a great flexibility in the approach. So again, we can drop ship kits, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. We're based just outside Boston, and we've got a number of facilities here. So we have 2 clear high complexity labs. We have a FDA registered manufacturing facility, and we have an R&D facility, which is headed up by Dr. Dorval, who is involved in the company on a day-to-day basis. So as I mentioned, it's a patented test. So that's why we're the only company that's able to look at the IgG plus complement combined. And again, that gives us a much simpler report for you guys all to review, as well as makes it much simpler for a patient. As I say, we're very much focused around this area. So we own the C3d cell line. We've developed specific lyophilization technologies. All the foods are traceable, they're all organic. So again, we know where everything comes from, which is very helpful. And again, we've been growing internationally. So we have now labs in Mexico, Brazil, Shanghai, and as some of you may not be surprised with my accent, the UK in terms of London as well. So as was mentioned up front, we have a number of panels that we're offering, and we have and again, the idea is to give you an option from different price points. Again, we want to be sensitive that not every patient that you see is in the top 1%. We want to make sure testing is for the 99, not the 1%. And our approach is, how do we make that accessible by not only the number of foods, but trying to combine as many things on the panels as possible. So the FIT 22 is the foods here in orange, which is the 22 most common foods. This we generally send to all providers. It's a laminated copy of a sheet, so again, it's easy for patients to understand. Then the orange plus the green foods are the FIT 132, and then everything on this sheet is our new panel, the FIT 176, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. So again, the patient report is very simple, and that's intentional. The idea is not to try and kind of baffle people. The idea is we want this report to be something that you, a busy provider, can read and understand and assimilate very quickly. So it's just 2 pages. The front page gives them the foods they need to eliminate. The second page is this color-coded approach. And as you can imagine, red, orange, and yellow are the ones to avoid. The dark green, they're all good to go. Another important element, I think, what that differentiates us, again, is the fact that we look at colorings and additives. And the reason we do that is, A, there's plenty of literature out there showing the damage that does to gut lining anyway, but you find them in processed foods which your patients are in. You find them in supplements as well, and you also find them in skincare products. So our view is it's important to measure those, because those are all different elements where you're seeing patients consuming those foods. So again, you want to make sure you draw that out. And I think there are 3 very important elements that I think, again, helps differentiate this test from some of the others on the marketplace. As I mentioned up front, we're looking at food sensitivities via the IGG1-4, but we're also looking at inflammation via the complement activation. And the third element, as I mentioned, is leaky gut. And we do that with 3 elements. So if there are more than 10 foods elevated, so on this report, we define that by the yellow, orange, and red. And is there candida elevated? And again, candida exists. We're measuring it for the IGG1-4 and complement. And so generally in our world, if that is elevated, that's indicative that there may well be some leaky gut going on. So it's not a test for candidiasis. It's more looking, is there some kind of leaky gut going on that would cause that candida to be elevated as measured by the IgG and complement. And thirdly, zonulin, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the new test that we're about to add to all the panels that we put out there. So again, as I mentioned up front, one of the key elements, we're trying to make sure it's easy for a patient to understand the report and be compliant by the number of foods. How do we get there? Good science. But then on top of that, we want to give the patient and you, the busy provider, some key tools to enable that to happen. So for many of you who've run these tests before, you'll be aware that one of the first questions that you'll get from a patient is, okay, doc, so I understand this, or nutritionist, I understand the test, but what can I eat? You've told me all the things I can't eat, but what can I eat? So what we do is we've got a team of nutritionists who develop individualized meal plans for each patient based on the FIT 132 or the 176 test that we run. So rather than just saying bad news, here's a list of foods you can't eat, our view is let's make it a more positive experience and let's give them some hope in the journey forward by giving them a meal plan at the same time as a review of the results. And generally what we found is patients and frankly providers love it. I'm yet to find a provider who loves doing meal plans. So then this gives you an opportunity to give them a pathway forward and take ownership as they move forward on their journey to the removal or elimination of whatever symptoms they may well be presenting when they come in and see you. The other key element that we've worked on as well is a meal plan. That doesn't seem to be on here today, but again, we've developed an individualized meal, app, and so that's available for both Apple and Android phones. And that generally we send to the patient 14 days after the patient has received or you've received the results. So the idea is you get a chance to review the results with the patient, and then on top of that, then they then get the app as a reminder. And what you see on the app is the meal plan. So if they're grocery shopping, they've got the opportunity to take that with them. It's in their hand. We give them their full test results again. And again, we find that really helpful because again, they want to review what they're positive for, obviously, but more importantly, what else they got tested for. The other neat thing, for the things they were positive for, we show them what that might cross-react with, where they might find it, and alternatives and substitutes. And the other neat thing that you'll find with the app is that for patients, it's a great marketing tool for you and your practice because they love to share those results with their friends and family. And as they're out eating dinner or something, they'll often bring out the app and they'll show that to their friends and family. So it's a great referral tool, which lots of practitioners tell me has worked really well for other patients to bring in their friends and family into the practice. So again, there's nothing like a bit of free marketing for you. And as we all know, that's always a tough thing to do for your practice. So again, that's a neat thing that the app provides as well as the meal plan. So again, I just wanted to touch on some of the new assays we're developing and have developed so that you are aware of some of the new things coming through. And we'll talk about them now. So the FIT 176, the FIT 44, the Zonulin, and then the FAST test as well. So the FIT 176, we worked with just over 150 providers on this to come up with, okay, we had the FIT 132. Well, there's some new foods that we can add to make the test kind of more relevant in terms of as we kind of move forward in today's world. So we looked at and thought about how we could apply, some of the key supplements that are people using, what were some of the kind of things we needed to add. So I think some of the highlights that we came up with, we beefed up the kind of grain area in terms of gliadin and things like that. We added some sweeteners, so things like monk fruit and stevia as key things. As I said, we wanted to think from a supplement standpoint as well. What's one of the key supplements people get given if they're inflamed? It's clearly omega-3. So we thought, let's add the 3 fish which are in omega-3. So we've done that. So again, rather than you give them an omega-3, if you know that they're sensitive to these, then that's been helpful. The other things that we've added, I think we're the only company in the world to do it, is we're also measuring CBD as well. We've added chia and hemp seed as well. So again, we've tried to kind of upgrade the report and the panels to kind of reflect what I think people are eating or foods we'd like them to be eating as well. So in essence, we found that this has worked well for 2 really quite distinct groups of patients. So the patients who are very healthy and are looking for that kind of final 10 or 15% improvement, they really like the new FIT 176 because these are foods that they're currently consuming. So they want to test to see, are they healthy for them as an individual or not? And so again, that's been really good for that group of patients. But then also patients who are looking for a bit of a reset post-pandemic, who might have put on weight or anything, they found that with these additional foods in the meal plan, that's been a wider type of foods that they're consuming or can consume based on the meal plan we give them. So it's interesting how that's kind of almost delineated around those 2 different groups with the FIT 176. The other thing we did was we had, we've been doing this for a number of years. We had a number of providers come to us and say, look, I've had a lot of patients who've run your 132. They'd really like to do the 176. They may not want to run all the 132 foods again. Can we give them an opportunity to run the 44? So we've launched the FIT44 with that in mind, to say this is for patients who might have done, one of the earlier tests and now want to kind of upgrade to the 176, may not want to run all of those foods. So this is kind of like a subset. And so again, hopefully this will give you a way of going back to some of the patients that, to re-engage with them and talk to them about the FIT44 versus, just talking about the same old 132. We've got these additional foods that they may want to get tested for as well. So then moving on to zonulin. Again, it's an area that we've had a test in for a number of years. And we really like it as an area because, again, it's a great biomarker for intestinal permeability, but it's really cool because it's reversible. So again, it's not like the patient's doomed if they have elevated zonulin. And the other nice thing is there's some clear clinical pathways and treatment pathways that you can go down with some of the great gut healing protocols that are out there for a number of the supplement companies. So the idea is if they have elevated zonulin, you can put them on some of those gut healing protocols as well as eliminate the foods. The other cool thing about zonulin is when you look through the clinical literature, there's a lot of these disease states on the bottom of this slide have been linked with elevated zonulin. So yes, it's a great marker for intestinal permeability, but you also might want to consider some of these other elements as well when you see a patient who has elevated zonulin. So probably a little bit like our food sensitivity test, rather than just settling for the IgG only approach, we've added the complement to kind of make it a much more, I guess, targeted list of foods the patient has to review or has to eliminate based off not only exposure but also inflammation. With zonulin, we took the same approach. Rather than just look at some of the tests that were out there, why don't we look to develop our own, given that we've got our own R&D facility, and that enables us to look at some of these tests and see if we can improve on what's gone in the past. So to that aim, we've partnered with Dr. Alessio Pisano, who I'm sure a number of you have heard, and our very own Dr. Brent Dorval, to come up with to kind of look at how can we come up with a test that rather than that would just be a lot more specific to zonulin versus some of the knocks in the literature have been about that, they're not specific to zonulin, they're measuring properdin and haptoglobin and not specific. And I think a lot of you will say, well, I've run a lot of zonulin tests, but the positivity rate is very low as well. And that may be because of, it's not specific to zonulin. So again, we've developed a specific antibody test now for zonulin that again does not measure properdin or haptoglobin, and more importantly, it will be part of the test. So whether you run the 176 or the 132, that will come standard. So again, back to the philosophy of how many things can we put onto the same panel, rather than asking you and your patients to say, well, if you're going to look at inflammation, here's another panel. If you're going to look at food sensitivity, here's another panel. If you're going to look at gut permeability, here's another panel. And before you know it, the poor patient's $750, $1,000 the wrong side of it. What we want to do is keep the pricing nice and low and add more and more things to the panel to make it affordable and give you a way of looking at those three elements with one test, rather than constantly kind of trying to come up with more and more ways of increasing revenues. Our approach is let's put more and more onto the same panel to give you and the patient a way of understanding a lot more from one test, rather than having to kind of spend a lot more money on each individual test. So one of the other things, and so again, that's coming live in terms of the zonulin. We're hoping that'll come out mid-February. So again, we're excited to do that. And as that comes out, I'll get Dr. either Fasano or Dorval on to talk about that development process that's been going on for the last couple of years, and talk about the test and how it differentiates, as I've just been kind of alluding to, than some of the other tests on the market. So I think that'll be a nice differentiator for us. But as I say, it'll be a nice one because it's on the panel. It'll give you another good indicator of leaky gut, along with the candida, which is on the panel, and are there more than 10 foods elevated. So again, we're excited to get that out and publicize that a bit more come the mid-February timescale as well. Last but not least, in terms of the development path, we've also developed a rapid test, which enables you, the good news, you don't have to stuff anything up your nose, which seems to be the vogue with most rapid tests that we're all talking about these days. This rapid test measures egg, milk, and wheat in 10 minutes in your office. So the idea is, how can you run this? You can run this in your office to detect does the patient have a sensitivity to egg, milk, or wheat? So if you look at the slide here in front of me, you'll see C for control. We're old-fashioned, like the 15 controls we like to run on our other tests. We make sure there's a control on the test that we run here. So it's a single drop of blood, and within 10 minutes, you get the result. So you see the control. So that is a kind of procedural control. That always has to come up. You'll see that's a nice ruby red. When it comes up, that's basically like a 4+ on our FIT test. E is for egg. And on this test, that would have been a 3+ for this patient. M is for milk, and that's probably a 3 or a 2+ there. And W for wheat, and you can see that was probably a 1+, a very faint one there as well. So the neat thing is, for some of the patients who maybe are reluctant to kind of run a full test, then you can do this when they're in the office. If you've got new patients, and again, I sometimes get the sense a lot of new patients walk out with a sore arm when they filled out lots of forms, but maybe you could run a fast test rather on them when they're in the office to give them some information on what's going on. If you're a believer in just doing elimination diets, well, again, if you could run this test, you could try and say, well, look, if this patient isn't sensitive to eggs, for example, then that's something we might include as part of the elimination diet versus excluding that as well. Because we all know, the more things you exclude, the harder it is for patients to be compliant. So again, this is just a neat way of looking to see from the big three, what might be going on for egg, milk, and wheat. Again, great for pediatric patients with that single drop of blood, and the instant nature of it, I think, unfortunately or fortunately, plays into the kind of general way of the world today in terms of looking for instant information versus waiting 10 days for results to come back to the lab. So that's the fast test, and again, happy to kind of talk to you as we look to launch that through Evexia over the coming months. So in conclusion, again, we have a patented multi-pathway detection technology, which, like I mentioned, has been broadly adapted. But again, that's partly because we've got great partners like Evexia that we've worked with in terms of expanding the network of providers who are running the test. Again, we've made sure we've invested in some best-in-class compliance tools. So again, we want to make sure the report is simple and easy for you and the patient to read. Again, the Vogue may be 20+ page reports, but our feeling on that is, look, food sensitivity is an element. It's not the whole story by any stretch. So we want to make sure that the report we give you is easy to read for you and the patient so that they can be compliant. The other thing, obviously, that meal plan is really helpful for the patient and you, the provider, as well as the patient app, which we found has been a real benefit to lots of patients to have that app with the results on their phone, which has been a kind of game changer in terms of the level of compliance that we've seen from patients. We've done a number of clinical studies, and Dr. Dorval will touch on that on the second presentation that we're going to run. Again, one of the key ones was we did an IRB-approved study looking at IBS patients. We took 100 patients, 50 in the control, 50 in the intervention, and saw a dramatic reduction in their IBS severity score, as well as a dramatic reduction in their high-sensitive CRP. So the idea was, could we measure overall inflammation, as well as could we measure symptoms by looking at the IBS severity score? So it was great to see symptoms improving for the patient, as well as overall inflammation decreasing, which really plays well into, guess what, the measurement of the inflammation versus just the exposure to foods, which we see from a lot of the IGG annual labs out there. And last but not least, we continue to develop world-class products with the likes of all our provider base who helped with the FIT 176, the likes of Dr. Dorval and Dr. Fasano on the Zonulin test, as well as Dr. Dorval's amazing experience of developing the first rapid test in terms of for our fast test as well. So again, we're continuing to develop products around this area of food sensitivities, gut and inflammation, and coming up with more tools for you to help with your patient population that you treat on a daily basis. So at this point, let me hand over. I think there's a Q&A, so I'll kind of go through that and hand that over to the guys there who can kind of look at the questions and take us through that.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for that insightful information. I'd like to, before we get to, we do have a couple questions from our attendees, but I'd like to have Dr. Fasano come off mute and join us for a minute to talk about his experience, because I know he deals with a lot of questions from our clients about this test. And I think he probably has a couple questions that we had talked about. So Dr. Sedano, if you want to unmute yourself and speak your piece for a minute.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Josh, and James. Thank you. It's a great presentation, and I'll tell you, I'm excited for the new information that I learned tonight from you with the new products and certainly the test, the egg and the wheat, just as a lead-in test. I think that's going to be extremely helpful. And also Dr. Fasano, that's pretty darn impressive. He's been around a long time, and you folks that may not be familiar with him, the zonulin testing, he's kind of one of the authorities on that, and the researchers over the last 10, 15 years that I know of, wonderful papers on him. You can go ahead and Google him. Again, before we had the webinar, I think James and I had talked. I get a lot of questions about food allergy testings in general and the different type of foods that whether it's raw food or cooked food, it's going to show a difference. And James, I'd like for you to speak on that just for a moment.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So yeah, we get that question as well, Dr. Wayne. So generally, what we say to providers on that is we're probably now up to just over 200,000 tests we've run. What we've seen from a clinical perspective is, look, there's no doubt that if you heat a food, it denatures. I mean, that's a given. But what we haven't yet seen is, from a clinical perspective, does that really make any difference? Because, as I say, with the hundreds of thousands of tests we've run, we're seeing some really good clinical outcomes. And what we've done on the panel is it's a bit of a mix and match. So there's some cooked items and there's some are raw. So again, we've tried to come up with a combination of those two, because again, our view is, let's give you a really good screen which covers a bit of everything versus maybe diving specifically into one or the other. Because as we all know in life, it's not all cooked or all raw. The world is a compromise between the two, and that's what we've tried to find. And I think we seem to be hitting the right balance in terms of just the feedback we get from our providers in terms of the clinical outcomes that we see in terms of on that front. But probably as you've seen, Dr. Wayne, as well, there's no doubt that proteins denature if you heat them. That's not an issue. The question is, does that then translate to any different from a clinical outcome standpoint? And we haven't seen that in terms of our hundreds of thousands of tests. But again, be happy if someone could show me the paper that supported that.
Yeah, by the way, you probably don't know this, but I ran the FIT test on myself and also my wife a year or two ago. It's been wonderful information, so I can speak from a little bit of authority by having ran this test on myself as well. But I want to tell the folks listening to this webinar, if you're seeing it, in my opinion, and I've been doing this for 20 plus years, if you're seeing a lot of foods, there's a gut reaction, immune gut reaction going on, you might want to think a little bit forward, think what is going on with the digestive system. That leads them into a stool analysis, intestinal permeability situation. But my point is that when you get this information back on, say, a FIT test, you could immediately take the pressure off of the immune system via food reaction in the gut. And that is extremely important. And I don't know, James, you may talk about your experience, but I know as a clinician, when the folks, it could be anywhere from 3 to 4 days to a week or so. All of a sudden, the patients will come back. You know what? My joints don't hurt a little bit. So something's changed. It can be pretty darn fast. So
I totally agree. I mean, you see some patients where you see that very rapid change, and it's things where they might have had migraines for long periods of time, but when they work out which of the foods are causing that inflammation, it's transformational in terms of what they see. So we hear that regularly, and it's and to your point, generally it's a pretty quick thing, and we'll talk about you eliminate those foods 5 to 8 weeks. Half-life of any of these foods is generally 23 days. So again, if you can get the patients to, and again, this is where I'd normally say it's your role as a psychologist versus a provider in terms of checking the patient on the other side of the table, how long they're willing to take these foods out for. But I think to Dr. Wayne's point, you generally see a pretty good response within that first 21 days. And so I think that helps, because you're giving that patient hope that, hey, wow, I ran this test, I've eliminated these foods, I'm already seeing a difference. So I think it really helps in terms of kind of moving, fast tracking them on that journey, plus the confidence they have in you as a provider that you've asked them to do this test, you've asked them to kind of, trust you to eliminate things, and they've seen a difference, which is a wonderful thing.
Agree. This was wonderful. All right, Josh, we're all
excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. No, actually, there's a question that came in that could potentially, both of you guys can chime in. There was a request if you could compare the LRA and ELISA type test for food sensitivities, and what are some of the trade-offs or the benefits that might be present?
Yeah. So with the ELISA Act, I think they're probably talking about in the MRT. They're what I would describe as indirect tests. So they're looking at the kind of swelling and shrinking of cells. So from those, they're basically telling you, based on that shrinking or swelling, then something is happening from a food sensitivity standpoint. Whereas what we're doing is a direct measurement. So we're looking for the presence of that food or the antigen for the complement or the IGG1-4. So it has to be present to kind of measure it. So again, what you find with those indirect measurements in terms of that swelling and shrinking is that they're great tests, but sometimes I hear from providers they're quite hard to reproduce because there's many reasons why your cells might shrink or swell, not just food sensitivity. So generally what we hear is that they have a lot more foods are positive, and the reproducibility is a challenge, again, not because they're not great companies, but because those, it's tough to reproduce those cells shrinking and swelling. And that's the kind of, I think, the difference, between the two tests. You've got a direct measurement versus an indirect, which leads to kind of sometimes, definitely a lot more foods coming up, but then also it's some of those tests are very tough to reproduce in terms of their approach. I think they're also, both of them are blood draw. Ours is blood draw or finger stick. So again, a lot of patients and providers like that flexibility, especially right now, that the finger stick that we use enables you to drop ship kits to patients, and that's always a big thing. It's really easy for them to do. We put it in a kind of USPS envelope for them to get it back to us. So there's a short YouTube video for them to watch, and we found certainly over the last 18 months a lot more of our providers have stepped up and have started doing that, because again, it's easy for them to do a finger stick. It's pretty difficult for them to find anywhere to do a blood draw without some guy walking out with full hazmat uniform on to try and do a blood draw on them. So our view is, if they can do the finger stick at home, watch the video, put it onto the blood cards. We've had a great level of success of patients doing that. And again, it's enabled practice to keep moving by at least doing some of the seminal testing on them, whilst not necessarily seeing as many patients in the practice like we're doing this evening. I mean, that Zoom and all these other elements are great ways of keeping that communication going. And by giving tests to patients that are easy for them to do at home, you keep that health discussion going versus waiting to always having to see them, which again, who knows what the next drama will be. But at least what we found is a lot more of our providers are kind of taking advantage of running these our type of tests with that finger stick technology and keeping moving and keeping the discussions going with their patient population.
That's super. Thanks, James. Dr. Sedano, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the question was geared around one towards, I think, was it LRA they were talking about?
Correct. And ELISA. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the lymphocyte reaction assay. It's a really good test, but again, it's looking for the lymphocyte to respond to the antigen and so forth. It's a different type of measurement. So it's comparing apples and oranges here. So it's a different look. Of course, we're looking at complement with the FIT test. We're looking at the IGG1 through IGG4. All tests have good sides, and so it's hard to decipher or make a great comparison between these two, because they're essentially looking at two different type of analytes. My take on it, they are both great tests to do. Again, one of the downsides with the lymphocyte reaction is that you got to have a blood draw and use a fairly sizable needle to get the blood out, not to damage the lymphocytes, which is a whole nother prospect in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only, again, we haven't, it's not the lymphocyte test, but it's the ALCAT test. The only kind of side-by-side analysis, as much as we've ever done on that, is when we did the IBS study, and when we compared that with another published study for the ALCAT, our results showed a 50% improvement on the reduction in clinical outcomes in terms of the symptoms, the reduction on the IBS severity score. So that's probably about the closest thing I've been able to kind of say, like, what's a like by like without anyone having done a like 500 patient study. I think they did 100 patients, we did 100 IBS patients. They were both IRB approved, studies, and what we saw was certainly a dramatic improvement in terms of the clinical outcomes with the FIT test over the ALCAT. Again, I know that's not the LRA, but that's as close as I can say of, everyone asks the question, how do you compare them? That's, I guess, two independent studies that were done. So again, if you look at those side by side, that's probably about the most telling thing. Yes, I sponsored one of them, but I certainly didn't do any of the analysis on it. So again, that's probably the closest I've got in terms of, a side by side, as it were.
Yeah, and there's a significant amount of data on the immunoglobulin test anyway. I mean, that's been gone for years and years. So anyway.
Awesome. So gentlemen, there's a couple of questions that are a little overlapping, but they're nuanced enough that I'm going to go ahead and just read them both. So the first one is asking, what the duration or the time frame for patients to have the food ingested for the test to detect it. If the patient suspects that a particular food is causing symptoms, but has been avoiding the food item for, say, 6 months to a year, will the test detect this sensitivity? Now,
and that's a great question. I mean, I think, do you want me to answer that, or is there more to it?
You can. What I'm going to do then, if you want to go ahead and speak to that, that's fine. But there's another question that's similar. So if you want, I'll pose that as well, and we can kind of talk about the nuances.
Yeah, sure.
So the other question is, how much of a food a patient would need to consume or ingest? Again, for example, if someone's removed, say, gluten from their diet for several months, should they reintroduce that? And what kind of a time frame lead up should they start to consume that in order to get the best results?
Sure, and they're both very valid questions. And what we generally say on both of those is we're generally trying to work out, what are the symptoms they're presenting with, whether it's to Dr. Wayne or any of the providers on the call, is we're trying to test what is it that they're currently consuming that are causing the symptoms they're presenting with. So the general advice, we don't want them to change the diet. Let's try and work out what it is they're currently consuming to do that. Now, your question is a good one. It's a nuanced version of that. And what I would say is 95% of the patients is just what I've told you, is don't change anything, because let's try and work out what's causing the symptoms that you're going to. There is a proportion of the population who said, well, I've already taken out, to your point, whether it's gluten, wheat, eggs, dairy, whatever it might have been. And so generally what our advice on that is, look, what we'd suggest, if you want to try to see, is that causing your response anymore, is over a couple of weeks before you run the test, have a few servings of that food to see, by giving you that kind of level of exposure, we'll be able to tell on the test, is that causing you, a recurrence of the symptoms that you were presenting with, which probably led you to eliminate those foods in the first place.
Yeah, I generally have told, I've had this asked before, and a slice of bread a day will do it, as long as you're not celiac.
Exactly.
Things of that nature. But if you want to see, and about 2 weeks out, typically we'll have enough to seroconvert.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. All right, gentlemen, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up the Q&A and move on. I know that I want to just take a minute, if you don't mind, to advance the slides. Thank you, James. So want to remind everyone that we do have the clinical support from Dr. Sedano available through our free Ask the Doctor service to address questions about patient scenarios, results, and testing. And now that we've learned about these excellent tests and the benefits and clinical value that they offer, I'd like to review how to order them through our platform. But before we do that, I want to I know that James had touched on it, but I want to highlight that we are going to be offering a special promotion for those of you that have yet to try the FIT test. So if you've never ordered a FIT 132 or a FIT 176 through Evexia Diagnostics, we will be offering a $100 account credit for the first test performed. This would effectively bring down the cost of the FIT 132 down to $175 and the FIT 176 down to $275. Now, this special promotional discount will be valid until our next webinar in the series, which is scheduled for April 13th. And again, as James had mentioned, that second in the series will be with Dr. Dorval. He'll be kind of reviewing and going through like a case study and a report review so that you can get a better understanding, and hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of this promotion so that you can then also kind of walk through that presentation with your own results or a result of your patient.
Yeah,
So,
and just to kind of add to that, I mean, I think, I speak to a lot of providers, as all three of us do on this call, but I'm often asked, I like to run a test before I offer it to my patients, and I think that's a fantastic approach. So this offer, I think, is a great way of dipping your toe in the water, giving it a go, and as I say, with the add-on of having the inventor of the test then review those results on that April 13th kind of webinar, I think gives you a really neat way of kind of getting a lot of exposure in a pretty good way. And I think, the Evexia discount is a fantastic way of doing that.
Excellent. Thank you, James. So now let's go ahead and review how to order these tests through the platform. So first, you would log into your Evexia account and click Evexia Link Lab Orders, which is located on the left-hand side of the dashboard. Next, you would select your intended patient or add a new patient. Then click Add New Order, select Specialty Labs, then add KBMO products to order and search for the desired test. Now, finally, you would just preview and confirm your order once it has been added to your cart and simply click Place Order. Of course, we are always happy to assist you with any questions or issues that you may have had. You can reach us during our business hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern Time at 888-852-2723, Monday through Friday. You can also contact us anytime via email at info@evexiadiagnostics.com. And again, thank you, James. Thank you, Dr. Sedano. Thank you, everyone, for attending and joining us for this webinar event. Until next time, from everyone at Evexia Diagnostics, stay healthy, stay safe, and we wish you all the best on your pathway to wellness. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Take care.
Take care.